Okay, so this video is about charts. I used this program, Eon Timeline, to make this. I wanted to just go through some stuff here that I thought was interesting. This is a timeline of mostly Apple Silicon stuff, release dates, devices, and things like that. So you can see this green line here is the first Apple Silicon that was ever released in 2010 with the original iPad, iPad 1. And that was the Apple A4 on April 3rd, 2010. And it was discontinued, I believe, when the iPhone 4 was no longer being sold. Apple does this thing where when they release a new iPhone, they still sell the old one. So this lasted in the iPhone 4 until about 2013. Then you can see the A5 is here, which went into more things, the iPad 2, the 4S, and the iPad mini. And you can also see the A5X is here, which was another iPad chip that's later on. Then you have the A6 with the iPhone 5, the A7, which was in some iPads, the A8, which had an absolutely just massive lifespan from 2014 to 2022. I think it was the iPad mini that kept it alive that long. This is really an Apple Silicon timeline, not an Apple devices timeline. There are less distinctions drawn between the devices than there are between the actual chips. The point of this timeline is the chips, not really the devices. Here's the A10 Fusion and the 11 Bionic, and the events that appear as just regular diamonds instead of bars have not yet been discontinued. So, for example, the A8 is no longer being produced. It's no longer in any devices that Apple sells. This was its lifespan. The A17 Pro is present in the iPhone 15 Pro and the iPad mini, and so it's still being sold. I actually don't think the iPhone 15 Pro is still being sold, but the iPad mini is, so it still counts. The diamonds are ones that have not yet been discontinued, and the bars are the ones that are discontinued. Okay, so here you have all of the iPhone chips, starting from the A4, going all the way to the A18 and A18 Pro, which are in the iPhone 16 line, and you can also see where they appear in iPads, and you can also see the related M chips that Apple started producing, like the M1, the M2, the M3, and the M4, based on these newer generations. And so that's that, all the way from the middle of 2010 till present day. Then down here, you'll find the iPad and Mac chips in blue. So the very first X chip, quote unquote, that Apple released was in 2012. And you see it had a very, very short lifespan, the A5X, which was based on the A5. And I don't know actually what device they put this in. I don't remember. So I just went and checked. And the A5X actually is in the iPad third generation. It's the first X chip, and I think the third generation is the first Retina iPad. And Apple says that they needed the X chip to be able to drive the Retina display on the iPad. A regular iPhone chip wouldn't cut it, so they had to make the A5X X for the first time to drive the Retina display. And the A6X is actually in the iPad 4th generation, not the iPad 3rd generation. So you can see the timeline shifted around a little bit. I added this extra thing, so that was my mistake. And you can see the A6X, which was in 4th gen iPad. Anyway, then you have the A8X, the A9X, the A10X Fusion, which had a pretty long lifespan in the iPad Pros. The A12X Bionic, the A12Z Bionic, which was also in the developer transition kit, which is actually not on this chart, but was there. And then you have the Apple M1, which is effectively an A14X chip. But once they started putting them in the Mac, they stopped doing the X thing and they started doing the M thing. It sounds a lot nicer to put a Mac chip in an iPad than it sounds to put an iPad chip in a Mac, but basically that's what they were doing. Although, as anybody can tell you, starting around the A10X and certainly by the A12X, the iPad, quote unquote, chips were faster than most of the MacBooks that Apple was selling in 2018. Certainly by the A12X, that was true. The base MacBook Air and the base 13-inch MacBook Pro were definitely not as fast as the A12X Bionic. Then you have the M2, which you can see was just in a whole bunch of stuff. So was the M1. Just like once they started putting it in Macs, it was really like a free-for-all. And then this is not supposed to be here. I'm just going to get rid of that really quickly. Then you have the M3, the M3 Pro and Max. These are separated because the M3 Pro and Max have already been discontinued with the launch of the new MacBook Pros with M4. But the original M3 is still available in the MacBook Air. Same thing with the M4. The M4 was released much earlier in the iPad before it was released with the MacBooks and the Pro and Max came out. We're just going to skip over this purple one for a second here and go down to this down here. These are the watch chips. You can see these have not existed for as long, and they don't tend to get as long of a life, although there's really not a huge variation between most of these chips. But you can see that the Apple S3 was the longest. I think that's because of the Apple Watch SE, the original Apple Watch SE, I think, had this. Then down here you can see some of the chips they put in Macs before they switched to Apple Silicon after the Touch Bar came out, the Apple T1, and then the Apple T2, which had a pretty long life, all things considered. And then you can see some chips that they put in their AirPods of different sorts. The W1 was in the original AirPods, the H1 was in AirPods 2. And then down here you can see all the devices and their associated chips. So you can see the iPhone 4 has an A4, so does the iPad 1. You can see the iPad Mini 4 has an A8, but the iPad Pro has an A9X. The MacBook Pro 16-inch 2021 has an M1. These are the short names. I didn't make distinctions between the M1 Pro Max and Ultra. You can see the full name there in the tooltip. It was more like by generation. And you can see that there's a lot of devices here. Like before, like I said, the diamonds are devices that are still being sold, and then the bars are devices that are discontinued. The reason I put all this together and I wanted to look at it is more for the curiosity of some stuff that I noticed about important events. So let's scroll back up to this blue section here for a minute. Just to keep your bearings, this blue line here is the first iPhone. This green line here is the first Apple Silicon chip, the A4. And so let's look at some of these important events that happened. So you can see in 1997, we have Rhapsody OS. That was the beginning of Mac OS X. Here in 1999, we have the first version of Mac OS X, although it doesn't really look like Mac OS X, and it also is numbered pretty weird, and it's also a server operating system. It's just very strange. It's a very strange thing, 1999. Then you have the first Mac OS 10.0 Cheetah Mac OS X, 24th of March 2001. Then you have the end of Mac OS 9. This is where support was ended. Then you have the death of Mac OS 9, which was this kind of publicity stunt that happened at WWDC in 2002. Then you have Rosetta 1, and Rosetta 1 was a piece of the PowerPC to Intel transition, which we'll talk about in a second, for the Macs in 2005 and 2006. Then you have the move from Core to Core 2 Intel chips in 2006. The very, very first generation of Intel Macs had Core CPUs, which were 32-bit, and then immediately, like within 2006, they switched to the 64-bit Core 2. Then here in 2007, you have the end of the classic environment. The classic environment could not run on Leopard. You had to have Tiger or earlier and a PowerPC Mac to run classic. And so when Leopard was released in 2007, Classic effectively was ended. Classic environment let you run macOS 9 apps on macOS 10 with zero porting, basically, in sort of like a virtualization. In October 2009, when Snow Leopard was released, PowerPC Macs could no longer do OS updates. Snow Leopard did not run on PowerPC Macs. In 2011, with the release of macOS 10 Lion, Rosetta 1 also stopped working because Rosetta did not run on macOS 10 Lion. So you could run macOS 9 apps on macOS 10 until 2007. You could run PowerPC apps on Intel Macs until 2011, and you could update your OS on a PowerPC Mac until 2009. The reason that all of these are here is to show that Apple is kind of a fan of transitioning between things. Pretty much since 1997, at some point or another, every couple of years, they seem to do something that pretty fundamentally changes your devices, whether it's going from macOS 9 to 10, or discontinuing compatibility layer of some kind, or changing architectures. That seems to happen pretty frequently. We're going to talk more about that in a second. I'm going to get to that, but these are just some milestone marks that lead up to Apple Silicon. But here you have the first 64-bit Apple Silicon in 2013 with the iPhone 5S. And this is a big deal because this is going to lay the foundation for Apple Silicon to be desktop compatible, right? We already have 64-bit Intel back here in 2006. Now in 2013, we're getting the first 64-bit Apple Silicon processors with the A7 in the iPhone 5S. Then also in 2014, you have Metal introduced. Metal is important because Metal is going to be the thing that unites the graphics of Apple's platforms and is another thing that sort of paved the way for Apple Silicon to really work for the Mac. Okay, then OpenGL is deprecated. In 2019, Apple removes 64-bit Intel x86 supported applications from their operating system. macOS Catalina, which is released in the fall of 2019, does not support 32-bit Intel x86 applications. That means all of Carbon was an intermediate framework between macOS 9 and macOS 10 that Apple used for a very long time, but all of Carbon and all 32-bit Intel applications were then removed. And this was really important because the next year they were going to transition to ARM, and they were going to be able to emulate only 64-bit Intel applications with Rosetta 2, which they introduced in the next year. And I don't know why they chose to do this here. The only thing I could possibly think of is that they didn't want to say, hey, we're transitioning to our own silicon, and that means all of your 32-bit apps are garbage now. They would have rather said, hey, we've decided you don't need 32-bit apps anymore, and then the next year they didn't have to worry about it. That's my guess. Anyway, let's go and look at some more important events with this timeline. So we can see all this here, and you can see all these important events. Let's go put on some new things, okay? So first of all, the very, very first computers Apple ever released were not called Macintoshes. They were actually just called Apple, and then they had some other ones that we're not going to talk about. But basically, the Apple I was released in 1976, and the Apple I and Apple II ran 6502 MOS technology type processors. Okay, and so this gray area here represents all of the Apple computers that ran on a 6502 base sort of architecture. Okay. Then you have the Macintosh. The first Macintosh came out in 1984, and it ran on a Motorola 64K processor. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to keep referring to these as 64K Macs, even though the Motorola 68000, also known as the Motorola 68K or M68K, is the actual chip that I'm talking about. So I'm changing it now. Say I press enter. There it goes. It changes. But just prepare yourself to hear 64K a bunch of times. And while I was recording this, I knew 64K was wrong, but I couldn't think of what it really was, so I just went with it. So you're going to hear 64K a lot, but it's 68K. Okay, I know. So you don't have to put the comment. Then you have the Macintosh. The first Macintosh came out in 1984, and it ran on a Motorola 64K processor. But several iterations of the early Macintoshes all ran on some variant of Motorola's 64K. Again, I mean 68K, not 64K. So if we put that on the timeline, you can see that here's the first Macintosh in 1984, and here are all the 68K Macs in brown. You can also see that there's quite a bit of overlap with the Apple, quote unquote, Apple computers running the 6502 chip. This is the largest section of overlap in the entire diagram. So clearly those Apple computers were very popular, which shouldn't be surprising because the Apple II was really a dominant force in the early home computer market of that time. After the 64K Macs, Apple began to transition to PowerPC in the mid-90s. And you can see this yellow area are all of the PowerPC Macs that ever existed. So there's a little bit of overlap, less than a year, between the 68K Macs and the PowerPC Macs. And by the time PowerPC comes into the picture in the middle of 1994, the 6502 original Apple computers that are not Macs are pretty much, at least in computer terms, well behind Apple. There's a good 3-year gap between those two things. Okay, so again, we have Apple computers, 6502. Then we have 64K computers, PowerPC Macs. Then we have the transition to Intel. And you can see that transition is also pretty short, all things considered. The first Intel Macs come out in 2006, and the last of the PowerPC Macs are discontinued also in 2006. And the Intel timeline is currently the longest. You can see that the 6502 was about 14 years, the 64K Max was the shortest at 10 years, the PowerPC Max at 12 years, and the Intel Max at 17 years. For 17 years, we ran on Intel. And this is also the era during which all the custom Apple Silicon was released and the original iPhone is launched. It's also where you can start to see some important things happen. So this transition pretty much wraps up the end of Mac OS 9, the transition to Intel, and then all of this stuff here, end of Rosetta, 64-bit Apple Silicon, Metal API, no more OpenGL, no more 32-bit, is all a build-up to Apple Silicon being on the Mac. Okay, and so then if we go ahead and look at Apple Silicon Macs, the very first Apple Silicon Mac is released in the end of 2020, and currently we are still enjoying Apple Silicon Macs, so it hasn't ended, even though the purple stops here. Apple started selling Apple Silicon MacBooks and the Mac Mini in 2020, the end of 2020, and they didn't stop selling Intel Macs until the discontinuation of the 2019 Mac Pro in 2023. So there was a almost solid 3 years of both Apple Silicon and Intel Macs coexisting at the same time. Is this because people are more dependent on their computer now and pulling the rug out from under them would have been harder? Is it because of the supply chain delays of the COVID pandemic? Is it because Apple was just feeling nice or lazy or couldn't replace the Mac Pro in time? I don't know. I really don't know why this took so long. So I thought that this was a really interesting timeline in history of everything that's gone on. We'll do one last thing, which is we'll go back down here and we'll turn on classic macOS. So classic macOS, oops, not repeat, draw. Classic macOS is that orange square right there. You can see it covers from the first Mac till about 2001. Things before the first Mac obviously don't run macOS. And then the Mac OS 10 era covers everything after that, including PowerPC, the Intel transition, a lot of the build-up, and then the Apple Silicon transition. And then classic Mac OS covers, again, part of the PowerPC generation, and then also the 65K area. Interesting that PowerPC is the only architecture to experience such a major transition between operating systems. All of the 64K Macs were classic macOS. All of the Intel Macs were macOS 10. Only PowerPC had both classic macOS and macOS 10 run on it. Very interesting. So that's pretty much the end. So yeah.